Hello everybody. These are going to be short introductory videos for the lectures for Unit 3. This will cover the main artworks and vocabulary terms that we need to know for the test. You certainly can look at the full version of the lectures still online because there are more examples that I'll be including here, but I wanted you to have access to some directed comments from me to sort of help guide you as you're proceeding to study art history in this online environment. So this will be our first lecture for Unit 3 on neoclassical. So of course, neo, the prefix neo, neo, means new, and classical for us always refers to the art of Greece and Rome. So in a way, neoclassical is a concept that we've actually already dealt with. When we started the semester, we were looking at the Renaissance, which is, of course, the rebirth of interest in classical art and ideas. So the Renaissance has really become the backbone of the way we've looked at art history since the start of the semester. But it is kind of frustrating if you think about it, that art is about the classical world, the styles and ideas of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, being revived in the Renaissance for a couple hundred years, leading into the Baroque, another 100 or so years where we still have the same interest in anatomy, in proportion, in creating believable three-dimensional illusions on two-dimensional surfaces, this belief in perspective, atmospheric perspective, making things feel ever more like the real world in painting and in sculpture. We have that going on for 200 years in the Renaissance, 100 years in the Baroque. We get a little bit of a detour in Rococo when things become a little more pastel in color, a little more imaginary. The storylines become a bit more sexual, more fanciful, and then immediately the neoclassical artists put the brakes on and decide that art has to return to its roots, that it's become something bad, and that the Baroque was a little bit over the top, the Rococo was way too over the top, so now let's make a return to the ideals of the Renaissance. It's almost as though the artists who controlled the academies had a very fixed idea of what art was and what it could be. That's going to play out for us throughout Unit 3, this reaction to what art has always been and new directions that it might take. So we'll see here that the neoclassical is very reminiscent of some of the work that we've already seen, particularly the work of Poussin, the French artist of the French Baroque, who used the allegorical gestures and was more interested in moral storytelling, mythical subjects, anatomy, proportion, all coming from the ancient Greek and Roman styles, that idea of the canon of human proportions, the use of contrapposto, all of those things that were sort of the backbone of the Renaissance were also present in what Poussin was doing, and that's what the neoclassical artists are building from. So the real leader of the movement is Jacques-Louis David. The other artists that we need to be really paying close attention to include Ingres, I-N-G-R-E-S is properly pronounced Ang, an American artist who moves back to England, Benjamin West, and an American painter, John Copley, are also names to be looking out for. We're also looking at some pretty important historical events during this time period. So, of course, you know the American Revolution is 1776, and as we move into the turn of the century from the 1700s to the 1800s, we have a revolution partially inspired by our own happening in France. Basically from 1789 roughly to 1799 is the major events of the French Revolution. And so we have the Reign of Terror, during which the publisher Marat incites mob violence. He really does try to get the people, the common people, who are referred to as the third estate who are rising up and seeking equality. He really advocates for the overthrow of the aristocracy. And in fact, of course, people were put to death by the guillotine, which was invented during the Reign of Terror in order to make the executions both more humane and more efficient, because there were so many each day. That revolution is going to end with Napoleon becoming the ruler of France. He eventually becomes the emperor, self-proclaimed. He then begins to take control of much of Europe. He eventually, of course, is defeated, and we then have a couple of revolutions that happen into the early half of the 1800s. What you can see that eventually the French are going to establish a true democracy, inspired much by what they saw going on in America. So the world is changing really quite rapidly. The neoclassical artists very much be in service to the revolution until Napoleon seizes control, and then they will become allied with Napoleon for the most part. This is a pretty remarkable painting by Jacques-Louis David. It's a great way to start our discussion of neoclassical. What you're seeing here is a story about three heroic soldiers. The Harati brothers are swearing an oath, and you see that there are three swords being held in the center that they're sort of swearing allegiance to. There's a battle happening. A war is being waged between the Harati kingdom and the kingdom of the Kurati, and it's such an evenly matched conflict that massive numbers of soldiers are dying every single day, but neither side is gaining an advantage. Neither side is coming out ahead. And so in order to solve the conflict, they decide to send the three best fighters from each opposing army to do battle, and whoever is still standing at the end will be the victor, and that will decide the outcome of the war. So in a way, they are sacrificing themselves, potentially, but in order to save their countrymen, in order to save the people that they represent. So the story is, of course, of noble sacrifice and heroism, but it's more complicated than that. What you're also having to interpret here is the movement and gesture of those female figures to the far right-hand side of the image. While the male figures are more stiff and seem very upright and action-oriented, the female figures kind of slump into a triangular shape at the bottom of the right-hand edge of the canvas, and they seem to be, of course, in despair. Well, of course, if they are the wives or the sisters of these three soldiers, that makes sense. But things are a bit more complicated even than that. The Harati brothers have married the Kurati soldiers' sisters, and vice versa. So now no one can really win. These three brothers, these three triplets, the soldiers on the Harati side, are going to fight three brothers on the opposite side who have married their own sisters, married the sisters of the Harati, rather. So what you're facing here is the ultimate loss of your own life or the life of your siblings. If you succeed, if you kill the other soldiers, then you're killing the husbands of your own sisters. There's no way to win. It's an impossible situation. And so the theme of a lot of neoclassical paintings is making the right moral choice, even in the eventuality that there's no perfect outcome. What is the moral thing to do, even when it's not easy? That brings us, of course, to the piece that you want to recognize for the test by Jacques-Louis David. This is The Death of Marat. Now, Marat was a publisher, writer. He was instrumental in getting people excited about, interested in, and passionately trying to advance the agenda of the revolution. And so he was quite frequently in a position to call on the revolutionaries to bring people to justice that they felt had harmed society, that had, by keeping their wealth concentrated among a small group, had caused harm to the people below them in the social structure. So on the one hand, if you are a revolutionary, Marat becomes this incredible leader of the people, he's a hero. But you can tell in the painting, if you look closely, you can see that there is a stab wound right here in his chest, just below the clavicle. You can see blood dripping down, and in fact, the tub that he's sitting in, which is a bathtub, would have had water in it, of course, is now starting to be tinged with red as his lifeblood kind of ebbs away. What you're seeing is, after the fact, Marat was actually murdered by a visitor to his chamber who stabbed him. And so you see this kind of fallen hero. It feels very similar to the type of lighting we saw in the Baroque. There's cellar lighting, lights pouring in from the upper right-hand corner. He looks like a fallen saint, and that's not by accident. That is David really trying to remind us of the importance Marat plays to the revolution, and he's really trying to almost deify him, make him look truly like a martyr to the cause. The reason we don't see the murderer is twofold. One, of course, it allows us to focus on the sacrifice of this, depending on your point of view, noble hero of the people, but it's also to kind of concentrate us on his power, because in fact Marat was killed by the sister of an aristocrat that he'd called for the execution of. So he was killed by a female. He was killed by Charlotte Corday. You can see her knife that she used right at the very bottom of the screen there, sort of directly below his elbow on the floor. So rather than, in a fairly sexist way, I suppose, to have it appear as though David is painting Marat being killed by a girl might remove some of his power, what we're seeing instead is the after effect. We see life draining away from someone. We don't see him being brought down by someone physically weaker than him, which might make him appear a little bit less heroic. Of course, if you were a member of the aristocracy and you were facing the execution of your relatives, you might not see Marat as a hero. So again, it's important to think about the fact that David is giving us a piece of propaganda. He's giving us an image that is sort of controlling how we feel about this character. We feel, based on the image, that he seems to be noble and hardworking and is dying before his time. If you're a member of the aristocracy, you would definitely not have that opinion of Marat. Now, of course, David did not witness the event. He is recreating it for us in a way that dramatizes the story. We also see that he's holding the letter from Charlotte Corday that's asking for an interview with him. So why did he have this interview with her in the bathtub? Well, Marat had a really severe case of a skin infection or a skin disorder, something along the lines of psoriasis. So he quite frequently worked by using the edges of the bathtub as a surface to put a piece of wood on to create a desk so that he could soak and try to soothe the skin on his body. So that's actually where she found him when she came to the meeting that they had arranged. Now, she ostensibly was there to plead for her brother's life, for clemency, and we know that she was armed, that she went there with the purpose, if he would not relent, that she was going to take her revenge, and that's in fact what happened. You can take a look here at the letter. You can see the writing instruments that he's using. You can see the blood on the note. You can even see the blood on some of the sheets of paper beside him, right under his arm. That brings us to one of the followers of Jacques-Louis David. This is the painter Ang, and his painting is kind of an interesting case in which it almost has an edge of falling into the category of the Romantic style, which we'll look at in the next lecture. The Romantic style often uses exotic locations, and this image seems to be taking place in a harem in the Eastern culture. We don't necessarily have a specific cultural reference. The character perhaps could be Turkish. We are, though, receiving some information about her being from an exotic place other than France, If you look closely near her foot at the far right-hand side, you can see a hookah. You can see, of course, peacock feathers in her fan. So there's this implication that she is somehow not part of French society just based on the setting of the costume. So allow us to somewhat classify Ang's painting as falling in the Romantic style. However, the body is rendered in such a way that makes it feel as if he's looking at classical sculpture as his reference. She feels a bit like the nudes that we saw in some of the statuary from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. Ang generally is better classified as a neoclassical painter, for sure. Harder edges, crisper, cleaner edges, a little bit more emphasis on the drawing, a little less emphasis on color here. So the idea of this painting, of course, is a rather unique one. You're looking at something that is meant, I think, for a male audience. It is a body that has been somewhat contorted in order to create this particular languid pose, similar to the way that the Mannerist painters exaggerated the body. You can see that there are certain aspects of her form that are rather impossible. If the lower leg, the foot that's nearest to the hookah pipe, is to be believed in connection to her hip, then take a look at where that knee and thigh on the other leg that crosses it are coming from. There's no way that that would connect properly, this thigh here, to her hip here. So there's a distortion there. The back also seems much, much longer than normal. And this arm feels much longer than this arm. So clearly the body has been sort of exaggerated to fill the desires of the artist for this particular image. Take a look at some of the close-ups and you can really clearly see the attention to detail here. You can see that there's not a lot of reflection of color from the fabric into the skin tone. So again, that makes it a little bit closer to the neoclassical style, even though she's in an exotic location. The neoclassical style sometimes looks so much like the art of antiquity that it seems as if it could really come from the ancient past. This is the work of the leading sculptor in Italy, Antonio Canova, and this is the sarcophagus for a relative of Napoleon. This is Paulina Borghese, represented as Venus. So she is presented here almost as if she is truly a Roman goddess. So imagine the change from the style of the Rococo. It still has a little bit of drama here, I suppose, a bit of sensuality, but it feels like the artists have willingly gone back to their roots and tried to create something that looks like it came from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. There's her back. It's a beautiful piece, but it is certainly more reminiscent of some of the work that we saw in the Renaissance than it is of either the Baroque or the Rococo. These I thought you would find kind of interesting. The other major sculptor working in Rome, in fact, is a French artist, Houdon. So a lot of the artists in the neoclassical style actually left their home countries. Many of them came from France and ended up setting up studios and working, if not moving permanently, to work in Italy. Of course, they're closer that way to some of the relics, to some of the classics of the Renaissance, certainly, but there are also excavations happening of some of the sites of the Roman Empire. Herculaneum, for instance, the ruins of Pompeii are being excavated as well. So people are having a renewed interest in the past. You see also, though, that these are faces you recognize. I'm sure at least the figure on the far right is pretty familiar to you, and that's George Washington. On the left, you have Ben Franklin, and in the center, you've got Thomas Jefferson. So these are sculptures that were made really for an American audience, and a lot of the sculpture of the founding fathers that we have in this country was created overseas because America did not at this time have a strong tradition or even a strong training, especially for sculpture. People were able to paint fairly well in America, but not as much access to the kind of training you would need to be a real world-class sculptor. So a lot of the sculptures that we have of these figures were actually made by artists overseas. Quite frequently, you'll notice that the figures are in contemporary clothing, the first two, Franklin and Jefferson, but it looks as though Washington is going topless, which feels a little weird to us, but would make total sense if he was a Roman senator or if he was modeled on the idea of a Roman god. Which brings us to some interesting work right here. This is an American artist, an expatriate, which does not mean that he hates America. An expatriate is someone who's living abroad but is still an American citizen. So Horatio Greenough was the most successful American artist, but to become trained and successful, to have a career and make any money as a sculptor, he really had to go to Italy to make his studio, to make his career. So Horatio Greenough is living in Rome when this commission is offered from the American government, and the commission is to create a seated statue of George Washington that was meant to be placed directly beneath the huge dome of the U.S. Capitol building. It was meant to sit in the rotunda. So Greenough was selected. Of course, it was great to be able to pick an American artist, but the work that he produced was not beloved when it was shipped back to America, because quite obviously he's rendered a realistic head and wig of Washington, but he's placed him on a body that bears no resemblance to Washington's actual physique. It makes him look like he stepped directly out of the classical proportions and musculature of the statues of the ancient Greeks, and yet he's posed like a Roman senator, warrior, god combination. So you can imagine how uncomfortable American audiences were seeing the president shirtless. Being able to see the body this way was unnerving to us. Now, to a European audience, they were a bit surprised that we were so squeamish and confused by it, because they understood what the classical style was all about, what neoclassical really meant. So this is an interesting case where this sculpture was moved several times. It's owned by the Smithsonian, and they have it on display, but it's certainly not in the location it was originally intended. Benjamin West is a really cool artist for us to consider, because he is technically American. If you look at an American art history book, we claim him as ours. If you look at a British art history book, they will claim him as a British painter. He was born in the United States. He was born in Pennsylvania. He then studied overseas and ended up settling in London. By 1768, he is one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in London. So he is someone who had to return to the academies of Europe to get the training that he needed, because that was not available in the colonies or even in the early days of the country. One of the remarkable things about Ben West, though, is that by 1792, he's elected the second president of the Royal Academy of England. So he is the leading history painter. We've talked about the categories of academic painting, and history painting, of course, is at the top. History painting categories can include scenes from the Bible, scenes from classical mythology, or significant scenes of actual historical events. So the idea of the death of a general on a battlefield, as we're seeing here, is a perfect subject for a history painting. The academy system in Europe was for training and for the elevation of the graduates of the academy to have successful careers as artists, and the highest goal within the academy system was to get commissions for large-scale, multiple-figure history painting, and Ben West is certainly doing that. One of the things that really is remarkable about Benjamin West, though, is that his figures are, although in neoclassical style, have not been redressed into togas and Roman or Greek costumes. They're in fact wearing the actual style of uniforms that they would have worn during this conflict between the British and French. This battle took place in Quebec. Like any good history painter, he has recreated the scene. He was not there present witnessing it. This is his recreation. And we know, in fact, that some of the figures who are in the painting, who paid for the commission, were not actually present at General Wolfe's side when he died. You can see an interest on the Europeans' side of the fascination with Native America in the inclusion of the Native American figure there in the foreground the left, he certainly looks like his body has been modeled on those examples of the statuary of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and he seems to be sort of studying or intrigued with what's going on. There is a certain patronizing kind of attitude, I think, toward the way that the native people are presented in these paintings, but we do start to see them more frequently in these works in the neoclassical. John C. Copley is a pretty remarkable painter as well. He, strangely enough, is largely self-taught, living in the colonies. He is so gifted, so remarkable, that he's able to learn a lot about painting technique and style more or less on his own, although his stepfather was an artist as well. What you're seeing at the far left is a painting that he made before formal training in any kind of art school. In fact, that painting, Boy with Squirrel, was his submission piece. Think of it as his audition to get into the academy for training. And of course, he was accepted. So he goes to London to study, and he ends up making his career partially in London. He was definitely well received by other expat painters, including, of course, Benjamin West. Prior to the Revolution, he did portraits of fairly wealthy, successful Americans. And what you're seeing on the right there, that figure that looks a bit like Jack Black, the actor, is actually, in fact, a portrait of Paul Revere. And it's not Paul Revere on his midnight ride saying that the British are coming, the British are coming. What you're seeing is him in his business prior to the Revolution. He was a silversmith. And so you see him engraving a silver teapot. So he's sort of presented in the act of doing what his business was, what his career was. Copley definitely, though, as he becomes more influential, more established as a history painter, does some unusual things, and this piece really does become probably his single most famous. Copley's painting Watson and the Shark is a painting of an actual historical event. Now, it's not as significant as a battle, but it was an event that people were really aware of. This was a sensational news story of its day, so it's rather unusual that he's taking this approach to make a history painting out of something that's this contemporary, but people flocked to see it. In fact, he had to make copies of this painting so that they could tour at the same time and be seen by more people. So the story is fairly basic. The nude figure that you see in the front is Watson, and Watson was not a terribly high-ranking member of a shipping boat crew that had docked in Havana Harbor. They had unloaded the goods. They were essentially on shore leave until they had taken on new goods and set off again. So people were on leave, going about various different activities, and Watson decides to go swimming, which accounts for the nudity. As strange as that may seem to us today, it was not unusual for men to swim in the nude in the 1700s and 1800s. You'll see that even in America around the time of the Civil War. So that accounts for where all the clothing is missing. But while he's in the water, having a swim in the harbor, he's attacked by a shark. In fact, the shark bites off his leg from just below the knee, and you can see the blood a little bit here, and that's where the stump of the leg is located. Now, obviously, the mouth of the shark is a little bit fanciful. Copley is doing his best to recreate what he thinks the animal should look like, and of course, the pose of the rest of the figures is also equally invented. Now, before we criticize him for making things up, we've seen this with other history paintings, and we see it in our own movie industry as well. The idea of recreating historical events in a film, of course, is different from directly observing it yourself. So poor Watson is under attack, and his crewmates are there to rescue him, and he was actually saved from being devoured, being killed by the shark. And he became really a notorious, famous character for surviving this kind of brutal attack. So he becomes a celebrity, and eventually he is even elected to public office back home in England. And so he is someone who became politically active really because of his fame, not because of his ability. Take a look at his coat of arms. Once he becomes a member of the ruling classes, you can see here there's the missing leg and foot in his coat of arms. It's kind of a funny side note. There's an interesting story from one of his colleagues that he was considered not necessarily to be a terribly good member of parliament, not terribly bright. They used to joke that because he had a wooden leg to replace the leg that had been devoured by the shark, that it wouldn't have made much difference if the shark had cut off his head and he had a wooden head in its place. Would not have made much difference to his ability as a public servant. So someone who gained notoriety for sure. John Vanderlyn is an American artist working at home. He does have work in Paris exhibitions, but he also does work in the United States. And this is one of those pieces that remained in America. This is Ariadne. Ariadne is the character who will eventually become the bride of Bacchus, but she has just been abandoned here by her lover Theseus. If you remember the story of the Minotaur in the Labyrinth, she is the princess, daughter of King Minos, who helps Theseus defeat the Minotaur, escape the Labyrinth. He takes her with him when they leave, but unfortunately he loses interest in her and kind of abandons her here on this island. So it's sort of a tragic love story, but it's more or less an excuse for Vanderlyn to indulge in showing the beauty of the human female form, and especially in a neoclassical kind of way. It's very brightly lit. The sections in which you do see light hitting her body tend to kind of minimize some of the contours. There are not a ton of deep shadows on the body. The shadows tend to be around her in the background, so we can focus on the form itself. Nudity, of course, would be acceptable in Europe in a lot of different cases, but in America we were still not really comfortable with concept, especially in paintings, in artwork of this type. So when this painting was originally purchased, believe it or not, it had a curtain on it, kind of like a theater curtain on a little pulley system that could be opened and closed, so that women especially would not be shocked by seeing this piece in the home of its original owner. Kind of a remarkable story. This is Charles Willson Peale, one of the most successful of the American neoclassical painters. He trained with Ben West in London, but then came back to what becomes the United States and establishes his career here. Charles Willson Peale was the father of multiple sons who became painters themselves, and he named most of his sons after famous artists. There's a Raphael Peale, a Rembrandt Peale, there's a Titian Peale. He also was of an extended family of artists. So Charles Willson Peale's brother was a painter, his niece was a painter. They were very well-known, successful artists in America. They did the type of thing that an American audience would like. For the most part, no nudes, for the most part, still lives, portraits, things that would ennoble the spirit. And here is near the end of his career, he's showing you his own historical natural history museum that he established. So there are paintings and taxidermied birds. There are portraits above the bird displays of famous Americans throughout the history of the colonies into the beginning of the Revolution. And behind him to the right, you see bones that have been reassembled. This is one of his other interests, was in essentially archaeology. He became intrigued by the discovery of mammoth bones. And so he had the skeletal remains, fossilized remains of a mammoth dug up, reconstructed, and placed into his museum. Pretty remarkable character. The American artists who are working on sculpture for our public buildings are few and far between. A lot of the sculpture, as I said, were made by either French artists, Italian, most of them working in Rome. Thomas Crawford actually is an American artist who settled in Rome and became leading American sculptor living overseas. So this is his piece, America as Armed Freedom, which is from one of the pediments of the US Capitol building. And it's a pretty remarkable piece in which you see America as a personified character here, very neoclassical in style, but you also see other American jobs. You see American pioneers, you see soldiers, statesmen, you see even teachers, but over to the side here, you see the fact that our culture is built on top of what was land that had been home to the Native Americans. And so you see a grave and Native Americans mourning death. There's the defeated Native chief as well. So it is a kind of remarkable piece that it acknowledges some of the negative aspects of how the country was actually formed. This is perhaps his most famous piece. This is America as Armed Freedom, and she is a statue who actually is on top of the Capitol building. That photograph was before the installation was completed. So if you look closely at news shows on TV, you can sometimes make her out standing on top of the dome. Other American sculptors are kind of interesting, as is Hiram Powers. Notice that his depiction of Andrew Jackson has him in a toga, so he's very much in that neoclassical style. But when it came to nudes, it was almost expected that if you were in Europe, you could show the human body in a way that the art receiving audience would understand. In America, not so much. So quite often sculptors resorted to storytelling that would explain why the figure was nude. In this case, this figure is meant to be a Greek slave. The idea that the Greeks, having been oppressed by the Turks now in the 1460s until the current war for Greek independence, which ends in 1827, she is a Greek woman who's being sold into slavery by the Turks. And so what you're seeing is an excuse for him, or a way of putting a story onto this figure to allow him to explore the anatomy, the proportion, the beauty, but to make it palatable to an American audience. Same thing's happening here with Erastus Dow Palmer. His story behind this piece is that she is a colonial woman who's been captured by Native Americans. So it has a little bit of the same approach, that the woman is sort of a prisoner, which explains the nudity, but it allows the artist to explore the body. It sort of justifies the nudity, which was necessary for a lot of American audiences to accept this type of work. There are also some American artists working abroad who are pretty remarkable, and they include women. It's kind of amazing to think that women were able to be as successful as they were in a very physically demanding field such as stone carving. In order to have these careers, of course, had to go overseas. That's the case of Harriet Hosmer, who quite frequently chose female subjects, in particular the figure at the far right, Zenobia in chains. Zenobia was the queen of Syria, and when her people were defeated by the Romans, she was paraded through the streets of Rome, the capital city, in chains as a slave. And you can see that even though she is physically defeated, she still carries herself very much as a regal, proud person. So you get the feeling that she is standing up to oppression. She isn't allowing her circumstance to defeat her. Another very remarkable American female painter is Edmonia Lewis. Edmonia Lewis is not only female, but she is biracial. She is the daughter of an African-American father and a Native American Chippewa mother. So one of the first artists of color that we can look at, especially female, especially in sculpture, and also made her career overseas. She also chose subjects of female power like Cleopatra at the left, but the piece perhaps most notable from Edmonia Lewis is the piece at the right. It's a statue, of course, commemorating the emancipation of slaves. So in this case, she is one of the few sculptors who created an image of this event, of this change in our society, without relying on including Abraham Lincoln as some kind of redeemer being looked up to as a savior or as a god. In this case, the freed slave looking to God, not to a human being, but they're looking to heaven for thanks. So that's our neoclassical style. Again, basically the late 1780s is kind of the height of it, and it does carry on into the early part of the 1800s. We're going to see that neoclassical is acceptable at the same time as a rival style, Romanticism, which we'll look at next.